Language and Cultural Studies at the University of Missouri St. Louis. She is going to be giving us an introduction to the Tale of Genji. Elizabeth Eckelkamp earned an MA in Asian Studies at WashU in 1991 with a focus on Japanese language pedagogy and classical era Japanese literature. She began her career as a Japanese language faculty member at WashU in 1991 and was invited to join the faculty at the University of Missouri St. Louis in 2000 to lead a new Japanese program. Interest in the program grew, and she proposed a Japanese major in 2010. Since that time, the program has grown in declared students annually, reaching a current level of 27 majors. In addition to language curriculum development, she also designed and taught a number of Japanese literature and culture courses in English designed for the broader student population, as well as Japanese majors, including classical Japanese literature, the world of Genji, the way of the warrior, and images of Japan. Eckelkamp spent the last decade of her career at UMSL serving in administrative roles ranging from Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences to Vice Provost of Student Success and Academic Innovation, but continued to enthusiastically support Japanese studies at UMSL. Since her retirement from the Provost's office in 2022, she has continued to serve her academic department as a teaching Professor Emerita and has enjoyed teaching the world of Genji again in the Pierre Leclerc Honors College. So without further ado, here is Elizabeth Eckelkamp.
Thank you very much, Kara. I really appreciate the kind introduction. I am Beth Eckelkamp. Just call me Beth, and I am not 100% comfortable to being tied to a podium, but I think there's a videotape going on, so I tend to be a walk around the room and have a chat kind of person, so I will do my best to stay tied to the podium this morning, or this evening. I'm really so excited to be joining you on this journey. I'm really thankful to the University City Public Library for choosing this amazing combination of books this summer. Of course, I've read the Tale of Genji a number of times, but I'm also going to join in reading The Priory of the Orange Tree, so I think it will be a great literary adventure. My connection to Japan started in my childhood, so I grew up in Japan, and I really never encountered or engaged directly with the Tale of Genji in my childhood, but I saw sort of remnants or impacts of the Heian period that our tale is situated in modern Japan. And so as I moved into my adulthood and my graduate studies and was introduced to the tale in a more formal way, I'd love to see the ties with this era, the Heian era, the Heian court era, and modern Japan as well. And so hopefully you'll have an opportunity to see some of those ties as well as we explore the tale. I did have an opportunity to teach the Genji course this past semester for the first time in a number of years, and I'm excited to say that there are still undergraduates that are very interested in reading and learning about this 1,000-year-old tale, so I think that's kind of encouraging. I wanted to open today with, let's see if I can do this correctly, just a note about the New York Times article. I don't know how many of you read the New York Times, but this spring there was an article about the Tale of Genji, and Motoko Rich, who's the New York Times Japan Bureau Chief, wrote this article, and it sort of poses this quintessential question in her title, what explains the lasting appeal of this 1,000-year-old tale? Why are people still wanting to read this in languages, translations all around the world? And so I wanted to share a little bit about what she said in this article, if you didn't have a chance to read it. And she says that she picked up the Genji Monogatari, as it's known in Japanese, out of a professional interest, and felt like, as the Tokyo Bureau Chief, there was this gap in her knowledge, not having ever read the tale. And so she talks about it as a tale that's described as the world's first novel, which certainly that attribution does happen, and also a touchstone of Japanese literary history. And so she reflects that the Tale of Genji has this grip on Japanese culture even to today, that there are bits and pieces of it, passages or chapters that are taught to school children still today, and that the translations, again, around the world, interpretations and adaptations, manga, anime, just unbelievably diverse art forms that have been used to sort of interpret the tale, and even a rom-com, sort of reflect on the real importance of it. She said when she first started it, she was reading for edification. She thought she might feel distant from this text, but even though it's set in this very distant classical period of Heian Japan, with its sort of mystery and this sort of elusive poetry, she, again, expected to feel very distant, but instead she felt this common ground. And she actually talks about a poem that is appears early in the text about, not that early, maybe midway through, about losing an opportunity to be with your children. If your children are moving away, or in this case, a child is sort of taken from one woman to be raised by another, and her daughter was about to go off to the university, so she felt this real connection to this poem, and I thought that was really sort of touching. But she says then the more she read, the more the work made her think about these things that we struggle with around gender and power dynamics, and how those have echoed through time. So, a millennia ago and yet today in Japan. And let's face it, around the world. This narrative is structured around the life of this title character, Genji, son of an emperor and his favorite consort. And that's from the time that Genji is a teenager. He sort of cavorts across the region, now known as Kyoto, and hopping from one woman to another. He breezes through affairs, takes on multiple wives. And although he amasses this great influence, he never actually ascends the throne to what would be considered the pinnacle of power, but he does amass power. And so through it all, our author, a woman, writing more than 1,000 years ago, continuously centers female perspectives in a work that ostensibly chronicles the escapades of a male hero. These are multiple Rich's words. And I think that's really something that makes this novel so unique and interesting and still sort of relevant today. And so that for me, and I think for many readers, one of the great selling points for the tale is this idea that it's sort of the first quote-unquote novel ever written, and this first significant literary work in the canon written by a woman. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about our author before we get in any further. And so Murasaki Shikibu is, her name, Murasaki, is attributed to her. That's likely was not her name. Murasaki means lavender or purple, and so you see that I've trimmed our slides in lavender just to pay homage to her. But it's also the name of a primary character in the tale, and probably the most endearing character, and so she has been attributed this name, Murasaki Shikibu, and she's a daughter of a high, sort of relatively high-ranking bureaucrat, and who was very educated, and he secretly passed on the knowledge of Chinese literature to his daughter. At this time, women were not allowed, expected, or thought to be bright enough to really understand Chinese literature, Chinese characters, and so this was limited to the study of Chinese was limited to males. But he secretly passed on his knowledge of literature, the Chinese culture, technology, writing system, etc., to Murasaki, and so she was incredibly bright. The Chinese writing system was borrowed by the Japanese a few hundred years before the time of our novel in a quintessential borrowing action that Japan has been so famous for over time, borrowing from the Chinese and the Koreans and that sort of that land that was the closest to them at this time, and then in later years borrowing from the West, and always then improving in some way and making it their own. So technology or automobiles or whatever you want to say, that sort of borrowing aspect of Japanese culture persists today, very much alive at this time. and so the writing system was borrowed, Buddhism was borrowed, there were a number of things that were borrowed and then made, sort of, Japan made it their own. And so I think it's important to think about the fact that this sort of borrowed culture, this borrowed literary culture from China, again, had been within the realm of the males only, and that our authors sort of had this this really key bit of knowledge and culture that that was considered to really not be in her purview. So there's a lot to sort of learn and explore about the Heian period. There's a few things to think about as we begin our exploration. And the note here that I have about this era and this time and this novel is, I think, pertinent to bear in mind. The world of the Tale of Genji and the world that we live in, there's a huge gulf between it. The language that the tale was written in is so far from modern Japanese that even Japanese today can't read the tale in its original. It's sort of like thinking about trying to read Beowulf or something. There's just, it's a different language altogether. And so without a modern translation or without some special study, there are even bits of the spoken language from the Heian era that sounds that don't even exist today. So there's a pretty big gulf, there between modern Japan and this classical period, and then thinking about then translating that. So we're taking it from classical Japanese into English, how much bigger that gulf is. So Japanese today read modern renderings of the work, and they, again, have a lot of supporting documents. So, of course, as Western readers, we need guidance through the intrigues of the court. And I think that the translation that Kara and her colleagues have chosen for us really provide that for us. There are a number of translations, and we'll talk about those a little bit more in detail, but this translation, Washburn's translation, does give us quite a bit of support. This critical edition gives us also some really interesting essays and reflections, if you're into a little bit of academic navel-gazing, but not. There's some quite interesting critical essays that accompany the tale as well. So again, much to really learn and explore about the tale, but a few things that I wanted you to sort of bear in mind, and these are some artistic renderings of the tale, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the Heian court was made up of a few hundred, so just a small number of courtiers that lived these highly protected and very cushy lives. They made up a tiny percentage of the population of Japan at the time. The monies that were extracted from the hard work of the peasants and the laborers across Japan were funneled into this court so that this small, tiny bit of a population could live these extravagant lives. No one wrote about the lives of the peasants, so we don't know about them, but we know about the courtiers because Murasaki Shikibu wrote about them. And so it's something just to bear in mind that this was not the activities that we learn about, the unbelievable artistic output that came from these courtiers because they had nothing else to do. Really, that was in this little tiny protected bubble of the Heian court. And the rest of Japan was suffering, actually, and the courtiers were oblivious to that. In fact, they considered uneducated folks, people that were breaking their backs to earn money to support them, to almost be subhuman. They had a very an arrogant and self-focused kind of an attitude to anybody outside of the court. So as horrible as that sounds, it's important to note that this is just not all of Japan cavorting about and writing poetry and creating art. This was a very small percentage of our folks in Japan. Another point that sort of comes up again when we're reading the tale is, what is the Tale of Genji about? And that that question is one that's been hotly debated for centuries since the tale was written. You come up with a bazillion different answers to that question. Clergy come up with different answers, and literary scholars come up with different answers. But I think for the Western readers accustomed to sort of a more traditional sort of novel structure where there's sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end, and there's sort of a point to the novel, it's a little bit of a challenge to think about what the novel's about. It feels like a lot of vignettes that are tied together with the same characters, a lot of collections of escapades of Randy Royals, and it's hard to say, what is it actually about beyond what seems like this sort of these risque kinds of things. But for me, I think what's really important to remember is who the audience was for Murasaki Shikibu. So she was writing this tale for court women. So she was writing it for an audience that she wanted to support and encourage and entertain, and sort of make them laugh, but also make them feel like they're not alone. And so I think that's really important to think about as these women are subjected to the whims of these powerful men, that they see themselves, maybe some of the things that happen to them, reflected in what's happening to the women in this tale. And for me, I think that is, I come back to that over and over again. Who's the audience? Who's really benefiting from this tale? Who is she talking to, and why? So Murasaki Shikibu will sort of have an ironic twist sometimes, and she will sort of clearly make fun of our courtiers a bit. But at the end of the day, I think, aside from sort of trying to relieve the boredom of the court women who are often just very isolated, I think also she's trying to help relieve their humiliation, help them see their lives reflected in other lives. She reaches back into the past and inserts, tales from ancient Japan. She utilizes poetry in a really effective way to tell the stories, and in that way, often she'll have her characters reflect, oh, this has happened to other women, and so you can sort of hear her voice trying to encourage folks that have suffered a bit to know that they're not alone in their experiences. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the world in which the tale is situated, so you have something to sort of visualize as you're reading. And so, again, here are a couple of works of art. This is a style of art from the Yamato school that kind of extends over time. But the fukinuki yatai, which is the concept of blowing the roof off of a room and being able to look down into the room, is the style here. And looking down through these sort of golden clouds. And the idea, there's a number of things behind the concept of these golden clouds. One is that things are more beautiful if they're slightly obscured. That's very much a Japanese aesthetic. Like, if you can't just see Mount Fuji clearly, it's much more beautiful if there's like a pine branch in front of it or a cloud obscuring part of it. A very, very Japanese aesthetic. And so you can see that here. There's also a sense that, I am so sorry, that is me, and I did not turn that on. That the imperial court is higher than the rest of the world. So we're up in the clouds, we're elevated, we're very special. And so that sort of, those two things sort of play into the use of the clouds here. But if you can see, I'm not sure how well you can see, but you can see that there are rooms, there are things that are divided up, spaces divided. And so they're here on the left. I think these are mostly male figures that are within the confines of these spaces with these screens, sliding screens. On the right-hand side, you can see there's a portable curtain-type screen, and where we see a woman, a courtier, and her ladies-in-waiting there playing a game behind these screens. And so there were a lot of attempts to sort of cordon off these spaces and make the women, especially the high-ranking courtiers, sort of not visible to male visitors, and also to be sort of special and behind these screens, and they were not meant to be seen. This is more of a modern depiction. It shows again a male caller coming to speak to one of our women courtiers. He probably couldn't see through the screen, but for the artist's effect, we see the gentleman behind the screen. And also, this kind of gives you a little sense of the clothing that our women were wearing. This is a junihito, 12 layers, a 12-layer garment. Summer or in the winter would be lovely, but in the summertime yet again, also wearing these layered garments, and very much the colors are meant to complement each other. You'll read descriptions of how some women are really good at layering their colors in their robes, and some people have a real knack at that. So if you can picture the women with a very, very long hair. Again, a lady in waiting couldn't wear these things because they can't move, but these are high-ranking courtiers that have a lot of folks that are waiting on them to help them be able to sit in these robes and have this long hair. So just a couple notes about this then. No one is ever alone. It's literally true, but it's figuratively false, and that is to say that our court women are surrounded by ladies in waiting, by this supporting cast, but these attendants and staff aren't real people necessarily. They don't really count as counterparts, so they're considered to be alone, surrounded by their staff. And so there's a lot of reflection on loneliness, and we read about a lot of poetry about loneliness and isolation. To be distant from, especially for the women, to be distant from men, that there's a level of dignity there. And so there's always attempts to make sure that there are barriers and blockades. The courtship begins and perpetuates through conversation, through these screens, or through poetry writing back and forth. And so when one finally claims the final intimacy, they're sweeping aside the screen, and there's like this dramatic effect of having sort of made it through the blockade. And there are lots of focus on the manners and proper behavior to sort of try to defeat erotic spontaneity, but let me tell you, Genji is not to be defeated in erotic spontaneity. So there's also this really interesting use of language. I'm very reticent. So the word yume, or dream, or the word kataru, to be talking, or the word even to see, miru, can be euphemisms for sexual intimacy, depending on where they occur in the tale and how they're translated. So it's very sort of curious use of language as well. This idea that one should not be seen by a man, a woman shouldn't be seen by a man. This is a great painting of a chapter wherein Genji and one of his, this might be Tomochudo actually, no, it's Genji and one of his men, are trying to peek through this fence to see this princess that they have heard about, the leaguered sort of princess. And so this idea of peeking through the fence, called kaimami, that's a very intimate act. It's a very aggressive act to peek through and look at a woman that doesn't know that you're trying to see her. So this is an interesting painting of that. So those architectural conventions that prevent women from being seen are important, because this idea of being glimpsed is really devastating. This kaimami, this peeking through the fence, that's where a lot of our plot turns happen in the Tale of Genji. Like, I was seen. Oh, you let yourself be seen. No, you didn't. She didn't let herself be seen. This guy like snuck around and saw her, but yet it's the woman's responsibility for having been seen. Women are incredibly dependent too for men for their place in the world at this time. And for those who have just become disgusted with men in general, they have one alternative, and that's to take religious vows, to become a Buddhist nun. And that escape does happen a number of times in our tale. Women can just stay at home, wear plain colors, and not be bothered by men. Men talk about taking vows a lot in the novel. You'll see Genji threatens to do it a lot. But there's a lot less incentive for them. They have nothing to escape from. They have a wonderful life. So, but that idea of taking vows does come up a lot in the novel. I want to, again, just in terms of architecture, this is a model of Genji Rokujo residence, which eventually late in the tale he's able to build. And you can see that there are these sort of long hallways that connect buildings, and that there are different wings. And Genji houses his ladies in different wings. The wings are designed for the seasons, and so the gardens would have plantings that would be relevant to the different seasons. So these are, this is not an imperial palace, but it's sort of at that level of design and decor and gardens, and maybe a little bit of a pond someplace so that one could have ducks or whatever. Very much the aesthetic of design around the architecture and gardens that take place in the tale. And this is a snap from the Genji Museum. It's one of my favorite places to go in the world. That shows sort of a life-sized depiction of what a hallway outside of the ladies' quarters might look like. The curtains are up because we're peeking in at them, but the gentleman on the end is behind the curtain. Looks like he's up to no good, likely going to peek in on our ladies who are, again, playing some kind of a game. So just again, it's helpful maybe to have a little bit of a thought about what maybe our ladies look like, what the gentleman's clothing look like, what the buildings might look like as you're reading the tale. So I was hoping that might be a little bit helpful. Another thing that's really key to our tale and in this Heian period were hierarchies. So the emperor at this point was at the sort of top of that food chain, and that the hierarchical design of the court was very much borrowed from China. That there were always a left and a right component. So there would be a minister of the right and a minister of the left, and then they would have folks underneath them. But in addition to sort of the political hierarchy, there were also contests, like court music contests, dance contests, wrestling, poetry, etc. And there would always be a right and a left, and they'd be competing against each other, east and west, some sort of division like that. And so we see that often in our patterns of hierarchy. Also, folks work their way up in offices, and so they might, in chapter 1, they might be the 5th counselor, and by chapter 12, they might be the 3rd counselor. So you'll see men sort of working their way up through offices with numbered rank. So it's something to think about when you see those titles. Another note about this concept of hierarchy is that a ranking gentleman of an important family at this time had one big goal, and that would be to present a daughter to the emperor or to the heir apparent, with the hope that they then also would have a child to try to secure power in the imperial court. The emperors had a range of these kinds of recognized relationships with women, not because they were so amazingly, they didn't have sexual prowess, but because they needed to sort of spread their prestige to a lot of folks, to appease the folks in the court, to make them feel like they were important. And so there would be an empress, usually the #1 important person at the top of that triangle, but then there would be several consorts and then some intimates, that would be sort of the hierarchy for the women. The way that we see sort of a reflection of that, the hierarchy of the Heian court, if you're familiar with the Dolls Festival, Children's Day, you see these stairs where you have the emperor and empress at the top, and then there are this hierarchical ranking of different folks in the court. And so that sort of, it's just a quick little visual of what that sort of hierarchy might have looked like. I could sing you the song, but I won't. Within the emperor's offspring, there's also this hierarchy. The emperor was not necessarily recognizing all of his offspring, only those that were important, politically or socially. If there's a son of the emperor that's recognized, it comes with a title of prince, unless that title is deferred, and an emperor's daughter would come with a title of princess. Princesses are not all created equal. So we have princesses with a lot of backing, with a really strong father, and we have princesses that might not have such good backing. We're introduced right away in the tale to a consort who doesn't have good backing, Genji's mother. And so that's not the empress, it's one of the emperor's favorite consorts. So this concept of backing, whether you have the right kind of backing or not, will be introduced as some kind of pathetic characters that just didn't have a strong family backing. The emperor has the choice to not have one of his important children be a prince, that he might be able to give that child a surname, a son, a surname, making them a commoner. And he did that in Genji's case because Genji didn't have strong backing on his mother's side. So it was easier, safer for Genji not to be sort of a weak prince, but rather to be a commoner that might get as much backing from his father as he could. So we hear people refer to Genji as Prince Genji sometimes, but he's really not a prince. He's a commoner, and that eventually actually benefits him, and that's a good thing for him. There's also this important to think about a little bit. Within the narration, there are some naming conventions, again, that can be a little bit of a challenge. Again, I mentioned that men are referred to by their titles, and those titles change from chapter to chapter, so it's a little hard to keep up with. But our Washburn does a nice job of inserting some personal names for us, even though they're rare. The personal names would continue throughout the tale. And so, if you think about it, if you don't have a personal name, it sort of even adds a little bit of distance or screens you from outsiders' prying eyes, sort of. But so it feels a little bit, I guess, intimate to give somebody a personal name, but Washburn does it without it being too gratuitous. It's actually fine. Women that don't have a title are often referred to by where they live, or by a poem that they may have exchanged with Genji, and there's a word in the poem. So a poem about a certain kind of flower, you might see that woman might have that name. And there's some lovely names, but the Washburn's nice about kind of helping us understand what those Japanese words mean within the reading. I also just wanted to touch a little bit on what it was like to be a reader, or what it was like to be reading in the author's time, in Murasaki's time. Again, as I mentioned, men studied the classics. That was, and they learned Chinese, women did not. That was unladylike. Murasaki Shikibu actually did, there's some record of her having taught the Empress Chinese on the slide, the Empress that she served, which I think is kind of fun. That's information that we gleaned not from the Tale of Genji, but from her own diary. And this idea of fictional prose, which is what the Tale of Genji would be, was only openly read by women. Now, there were plenty of men that enjoyed hearing the tales or reading them on the slide, but theoretically this was women's stories. And these stories were written in phonetically written Japanese, so not in the Chinese characters, but in a phonetic syllabary that was created from the Chinese characters. And again, as I mentioned, really the tale's purpose, the audience, was looking to be entertained, looking to look for circumstances that might comfort them. And